As Canada's fertility rate continues to reach historic lows, a new report is shedding more light on the reasons Canadian parents and would-be parents are having fewer children and how that affects their life satisfaction. Joining us now from the Ottawa area is Jon Mitchell. He's the director of the family program at Cardus, a nonpartisan Christian think tank. Welcome to Bridge City News, Jon.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
You bet. Lots to talk about. It's an interesting study. So what is Canada's fertility rate currently at right now, and how does that compare with other nations?
Yeah, so the total fertility rate in Canada is about 1.25 children per woman. So it sounds a little bit funny to talk about point of a child, but it's average. So the fertility rate is a estimation of how many children a woman will have over her lifetime. And we like to use that rate because it is comparable to other nations and across provinces. So with that rate, it actually puts us in the low fertility countries. So a country needs about 2.1 total fertility rate to replace its population without immigration. So at 1.25, that's very low. So that puts us in company of places like Japan and other countries where fertility is quite low. So it is a bit of a crisis, even if they're not necessarily talking about it every night on the nightly news. It is certainly something that we need to be thinking about.
Well, for sure. Now, the study shows that a majority of men and women want more children than they actually have. So, of course, the question that comes out of that is, why are we not forging ahead and having as many children as we would like? Now, your report says the perceived burden of parenting, which also includes the risk of compromising self-development, was one of the biggest factors. Do you want to unpack some of that? What is compromising self-development and so forth?
Yeah, very interesting. So I think when we talk about declining fertility and things that might prevent people from having the family that they say they want, quite frankly, we hear about finances, and that did show up in our study. But certainly this idea of personal self-development and wanting to develop as a person. So we see that in various ways in the reasons that people gave us for delaying or putting off fertility. But there is certainly this sense that there's a tension between maybe the person that I want to be or the lifestyle that I'd like to have, and also having children. And I think that's where people are kind of getting caught up. They see this tension between these two things, not realizing that, of course, part of developing a person is our caring relationships, right? And having children is certainly one way that develops us, but it certainly looms large. I should say this is the second wave of this survey that we've done. We did it in 2022 as well, and we found the same thing in that survey as well. So certainly that sense of personal development, personal self-actualization seems to be in tension with the idea of having children or having more children.
Yeah, I think it carries with it maybe a few things like I want to get an education first, so I'm delaying that till I'm, got that all lined up. Or maybe we want to travel first, these kinds of things. Certain goals I want to achieve before raising a family. I'm guessing that's part of it there. And the burden of parenting, well, it is hard work. I mean, that's the reality. It's going to take a lot of your time, and which again ties in with the personal angle of that. I want to do these things first. Well, now raising a family can get pricey these days as well. So again, you mentioned affordability was part of that as well.
Yeah, it does loom very large in our survey, as it did in previous waves. And that's everything from like the cost of housing and the cost of available housing, the type of housing that young families want, right? So that certainly plays into it. Job stability, economic stability. We saw certainly a reflection of concerns about inflation, about the general labor market. So all these kind of factors certainly play in for both men and women. Although one of the key differences that we saw between women and men is men were more likely to be concerned about sort of economic stability, sort of the global economic stability, how having children might affect their work life. Again, both men and women are concerned about this, but we do see slightly more among men than women.
Right, and I think what was maybe a bigger concern for the women, if I read that correctly, is that concerns about affordable childcare factored into this as well, right?
Yeah, certainly among affordability, that was one of the concerns. And quite frankly, that surprised me a little bit. The federal government, as some viewers might know, has spent over $30 billion over the last 5 years to increase childcare affordability and childcare spaces. And I mean, by my estimation, I don't think that program has been terribly successful. It has lowered the cost of childcare, but there's still they did not meet the targets for spaces. And I think perhaps this has raised people's awareness of that concern, and perhaps that's why we saw a significant growth in that concern from our 2022 study. We were quite surprised to see that growth.
Now, the study says that low fertility affects society's sense of well-being and happiness. That's really interesting. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so one of the things we did in the study was to look at fertility ideals and whether people had reached their intended fertility, and then have them respond to questions about specific satisfaction, life satisfaction, and then specifically about family satisfaction. So we found that people who are reaching sort of their intended fertility generally reported that they were satisfied both in life and with their family situation. We saw the lowest sort of life satisfaction and family satisfaction among people who overshot the number of children that they ideally would like to have. And then we saw sort of the second lowest level of life satisfaction and family satisfaction among those who undershot. Now, the thing is, we have way more people who undershoot their fertility intentions than people that overshoot. So in terms of actual loss of sort of satisfaction or family well-being, it's much more the case that people are less satisfied because of not reaching their fertility goals than overshooting fertility goals, just simply by the sheer number of people that are undershooting, which in our survey was among 40 to 44-year-olds was over half of men and women had fewer children than they said they'd like to have. So obviously at that age, there's still some time to kind of catch up, and we are having children later. But I think that's a concern. I think this should be a social concern for all of us, that if we're not having as many children as we say we want, that this has economic implications for the country, but it has well-being implications as well for individuals.
Okay. I'm curious, did you get any feedback from those surveyed who said, well, we just are kind of scared? I mean, our world is crazy, you know, there's so many addictions, so much violence, and, you know, financial trouble. So just kind of fear-based. I don't want to bring any more kids into this kind of world.
That certainly is a concern, and that did show up in our survey. It probably doesn't show up as much as people tend to think that it might. And in fact, in our last survey, we did issue a whole report looking at climate and changes in climate and how people perceive that in terms of their fertility intentions. And we found that often those concerns are tied in with other anxieties. So people that tend to be a little more anxious, maybe just in general in life, tend to express concerns about those things, about the state of the world and that as well.
Okay.
I would say that we did see an increase in concern around domestic politics, and that probably reflects some of the instability we've seen in terms of like trade policy in Canada and things like that with tariffs and that sort of thing. So that might be picking up on some of the economic uncertainty. We certainly can see that increase. But typically, we do see those fears, but they're not as expressed as some of the other things that you and I have talked about.
All right. Now, practically speaking, a low fertility rate has an impact on the sustainability of our national social safety net, economic productivity, and, of course, labor force capacity as well. So it affects our economy. We need people, right, to make things function here. Can you kind of break that down for us?
Yeah, so this is why typically governments are concerned about low fertility. This is the long-term implications and supporting our social safety net. And particularly in Canada, we are an aging society. For the first time in our history, about 10 years ago, our census showed that we had more people over the age 65 than under 15. And so this does create kind of a dynamic. Usually you would see a population, if you kind of chart it out by age, you get kind of like almost like a pyramid shape where you have lots of younger people, and then as you move towards the older age groups, it tends to be smaller at the top, and that bottom portion sort of supports the top portion as they depend on healthcare dollars more, and other sort of public pensions and that sort of thing. What we're seeing now is it's almost kind of like a wavy bubble, where we're seeing it's starting to look more like a cylinder than a triangle. And so that kind of thing does have implications for sort of the future productivity and sort of the economic realities of the country. So that's perhaps one reason why governments might be concerned.
Oh, yeah, there's good reason to be concerned, absolutely. When you follow that path down, you look what Japan's trying to do in Russia. We need babies, right? Now, are there certain ethnic backgrounds that want to have larger families, or on the other hand, smaller families for that matter?
Yeah, so we did ask Canadians about their cultural backgrounds and kind of compare that to their intentions. So we found that some of the highest intended fertility was around Canadians of African descent and Canadians of Middle Eastern descent, and our lowest was around Canadians of East Asian descent. So there definitely were some differences, cultural differences there as well, that we noticed in our survey. Yeah.
And what about religious or non-religious affiliation? Does that influence family size?
Religion is definitely influences family desire and family size, and this may actually in part account for some of the differences between Canada and the US. I would argue maybe that US might be a little more religious,
Yep.
at least culturally religious, and that may account for it. So certainly we found that in our study, we found that Protestant Christians tended to have the largest sort of fertility desire, or wanting the largest families, followed by Catholics and Orthodox, and then we found that people that reported being non-religious had sort of the smallest fertility desire. So religion
Okay.
definitely does play it, and it kind of makes sense in some ways. And I know in other surveys we'd find that the Abrahamic religions tend to have higher completed fertility, higher family desires. I think often religion is very family sort of promotes family, and then also just a supported community for people that do have kids. It's sort of a natural community where you're going to find that support in raising kids and that little extra help, and that makes a big difference, I think, in terms of planning for families.
Right. And education levels, how does that affect things?
Yeah, this was an interesting one because it was a little more clear for men than it was for women. So it tended to be that the higher education men had, the sort of lower their intentions were. But with women, there wasn't really a discernible pattern. We found women with some level of post-secondary education tended to have the highest fertility desires. So the pattern from there is a little bit murky. It's not a kind of predictable pattern like men were.
All right. And income. So higher income, what does that equate as compared to lower incomes?
Yeah, so interestingly, in the study, those who sort of be in the middle income of our survey, so $50,000 to $100,000 a year, tended to have the highest
Okay.
desires, and then it sort of petered down from there. The next highest would be 100,000 to 150,000. Those are sort of the two groups. So sort of middle higher income tended to be have the higher desired, and then a little bit lower. Lowest would be on the low income side, would be the lowest desires.
Again, maybe the pressure there of not being able to, provide for the family. Okay, so it would be then, sounds like, beneficial for our nation, economically speaking, and also for personal life satisfaction to have more children. Any thoughts, wrapping things up here, on how to convince Canadians then to move forward on this?
Well, I think it's a mix of sort of cultural challenges and maybe some policy as well. And I always think we have to be a bit humble about what we can accomplish with public policy when it comes to very personal decision making like family formation. But certainly anything that helps with affordability, I think, would go some distance in helping Canadians achieve the sort of families that they say that they want. And so I think at the very least, governments can remove barriers, particularly barriers to marriage. So in our system, sometimes we have unintended policies of marriage penalties, where a certain benefit that's based on household income, when people get married, they then have that benefit claw back. This happens in disability benefits, among some other benefits. And this can actually prevent people from choosing to marry. And so even just there is a correlation link between marriage and having kids. And so even just some of that peripheral kind of policy development might actually have an impact. When we look at what helps raise fertility, cash benefits tend to be more, tend to be a little more successful than, say, like funding childcare or something like that. But it takes a lot of money to boost fertility, and I think that's where the challenge is for most countries, is that sustaining that kind of spending is just not always in the cards.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for sharing this study with us, Peter John. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.